Hello, my name is Dennis Hancock. I'm the forage extension agronomist at the University of Georgia in the Crop and Soil Sciences Department. Today I'm going to present some information about legume management in Georgia. We'll do this in 4 parts. The first part will focus on 2 basic aspects: the benefits of using legumes in forage systems, relevant to today's fertilizer prices, specifically with regard to nitrogen fertilizer prices, and then also looking at some of the aspects of forage quality needs relevant to beef cattle operations and other livestock operations in the state. We'll also spend in this first section a fair amount of time talking about nitrogen fixation and inoculation, providing some information about each of those scenarios. In future parts, the second part will actually cover the different species, the areas in which they are adapted, and the recommended use, and we'll cover both cool season and warm season perennial and annual species. So there will be a tremendous number of those that we'll cover in that part 2. Part 3, we will spend a fair amount of time talking about establishment recommendations, the different aspects of establishing legumes in Georgia and considerations that need to be thought of there. And then also the final part, in part 4, we'll talk more about the yield that can be expected of this, and then also specifically the production response from the animal standpoint. This first section, focusing in on the fertilizer aspect, is relevant when we start to consider that in the past 2 or 3 years or so we've seen a tremendous increase in world fertilizer demand, and especially with regard to energy intensive forms of fertilizer such as nitrogen. But specifically in general, in the case of world fertilizer demand, we've generally seen an increase of about 14% across the board, and that's nearly equivalent to a new U.S. market in terms of fertilizer demand. Unfortunately, high fertilizer prices are probably here to stay. There certainly is a tremendous amount of energy that goes into producing especially nitrogen fertilizers. Other fertilizers also are tied to the energy market, but to a more indirect route, because inorganic nitrogen fertilizer is directly tied to the energy market, specifically natural gas, because the Haber-Bosch process of forming ammonia-based nitrogen from basically nitrogen gas out of the air is very energy intensive. You couple that with high international demand, a cheap dollar on the world market, and then all of a sudden we've got a perfect scenario for a very rapid increase in nitrogen fertilizer prices that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years. That's brought us back to an old way of thinking, and thinking about our old friends, the legumes. As Mark Twain is quoted to say, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it seems to rhyme." Certainly we have seen in the past very extensive use of legumes for their nitrogen fertilizer benefits. And throughout Georgia we've seen this rather extensively up until the 1950s even. At that point, cheap fertilizer, especially cheap nitrogen fertilizer, really revolutionized the agricultural industry, that first green revolution that we underwent. And I would argue that we're really entering in the second green revolution with regards to fertilizer and also energy concerns. But let's look at some of the benefits of adding legumes. And one of the biggest topic items relevant to the nitrogen fertilizer cost, obviously, is the valuable source of nitrogen that it provides. If we look at a species like alfalfa, generally speaking, we can get between 200 and 300 units of nitrogen per acre, basically in a full or solid stand of alfalfa. And at a dollar value of about 75 cents per pound of nitrogen, and that might be lower or maybe greater than what you're currently paying, but and generally that's what ammonium nitrate and other nitrogen sources are coming out at right now. And if you look at that value, that's a tremendous amount of nitrogen that's being added to that system. Even with our less productive species like white clover and annual clover, we get a tremendous amount of extra gain from those particular species. The other big benefit to us is the increase in forage quality. If we look at legumes here relative to the other forage species that we tend to grow, especially our most dominant ones here in Georgia being the tropical perennial grasses, whether that be Bermuda grass or Bahia grass or whatever it might be, both of those tend to be much lower in quality than our legumes and our cool season species. If we put this relevant to where we would need this to be for a dry cow, for example, we can kind of see that legumes provide more than enough quality for a dry cow. But that lactating cow is really what we're shooting for, especially with those legumes. And not only that, those animals that are calves as they're growing certainly will reap the benefits of those legumes in the system. If we look at how valuable that forage quality has become now because of the high cost of supplementation, we can drastically see increases in the cost per head per day if we're looking at changes over time with the maturity of the different hay crops that we tend to grow, whether that be Bermuda grasses as I've indicated here at the top, and then tall fescue here below. If we allow that material to get away from us in terms of maturity, it quickly becomes a real cost prohibitive thing because we are running into a very expensive supplementation cost if we're not supplementing that lower quality. So the idea would be then is we can integrate legumes into the system that could help offset those losses, especially in our pastures. So let's now talk a little bit about nitrogen fixation and the processes there, and then also talk about inoculation of that legume during the seeding process. Legume plants and the rhizobium bacteria form a symbiotic relationship. Basically, the plant provides nutrients to the bacteria, and the bacteria then, in turn, take nitrogen from the air and then convert it to ammonia. This is an important biological system. This is one of the most important biological systems because of its rather unique nature of being able to take gaseous forms of nitrogen, turn into useful forms to the plant. Again, this is a symbiotic relationship which is mutually beneficial. The plant gets nitrogen from the bacteria, and the bacteria get energy from the plant. But in terms of nitrogen transfer, what occurs here? Well, nitrogen transfer occurs in a number of ways. Obviously, one of the things is that we get some exudates from the roots and the nodules, but we also get some decay and sloughing off of some of those nodules over time, which can then go to other species growing in the mixture. So that would be then benefit to the grasses growing in the mixture with the legume. We also get a fair amount, of course, from animal deposition. In other words, we're taking the material that's deposited by the animal in the form of urine and feces, and then that plant is getting access to that. The grass plants that you can see here in the urine patches and dunging patches where these animals have been in that pasture previously. We also are getting a fair amount of organic matter decomposition over time, of course. Here we have a dung patty that has been undergoing decomposition, and you can see here we've got some active flora working here in the form of earthworms, drastically increasing the rate at which that organic matter is being incorporated into the soil. Dung beetles, of course, obviously are another source of incorporating that organic matter and causing and aiding that decomposition to occur. The interesting thing here is, though, that those legume plants have a specific relationship with certain rhizobia. What we generally see is a breakdown into cross-inoculation groups, or groups of legume species that have similar rhizobia species that will cross-inoculate. For example, clover type B will inoculate both ball, red, and white clovers. But then there we have some that are specific. For example, arrowleaf clover is very specific to type O, or type O in contrast is very specific to arrowleaf clover. Just to continue on this list, there are obviously other legumes that are agronomically important, whether that be the garden bean, soybeans, peanuts, cowpeas, lupins, others that also are quite important to us both from a forage standpoint and to an overall agronomic standpoint. So it's important that we inoculate legume seed mostly because the population of that specific rhizobium is likely to be very low in the soil. We generally recommend that we inoculate seed with fresh inoculant before each seeding, and that generally will occur with 1 bag of inoculant per bag of seed. It oftentimes is very beneficial for us to use a sticker material, and the old-time way of doing this with a little bit of sugar water or even something like Coca-Cola and mixing in with the seed is certainly effective, but there are also some commercial sticker materials that are out on the market. Now, a lot of legume seed these days will come pre-inoculated. They'll be coated with an inert material, something like lime, for example, and this drastically saves time and helps to ensure inoculation. It actually also helps in terms of seed survival during storage. In the next section, we'll talk more about legume species and the areas of adaptation and the recommended use of each of those, both the cool season and the warm season species.